polls as we go through the elective. Obviously, it's not like a graded thing or anything. It's just kind of to gauge what your guys' thoughts are. If you guys go to slido.com and you type in that event number or just scan the QR code, it'll take you right to the site. The first poll should be open, basically asking what your guys' thoughts are about Russia before we even start the elective. So we'll get started here right on. People are still walking in, so we'll get started right on time in about 2 minutes here. All right, so I've got 1,500. If you guys just walked in, go ahead and participate in there will be live polls. You can scan the QR code or go to slido.com and type in 65050, and that'll bring you to the live poll. One is open right now, and there'll be 2 more as we go through the actual brief itself. So for those of you who've already done it, the question was basically, how do you guys view Russia? A, diametrically opposed to the United States, NATO, or our allies. B, out for their own self-interest, regardless of what our policies are. C, looking out for the interest of the nations in their sphere of influence and their regional stability. Or D, I have no idea. Don't they just drink a lot of vodka? Kind of like the other option, but I was trying to be funny, probably unsuccessfully. So right now, most of you guys have said B, out for their own self-interest, regardless of the U.S. position. It's 58% of you guys. And then the next sizable chunk is diametrically opposed to the United States, NATO, and our allies. So I would say that is, I would like to hope that you guys think B by the end of the brief that I give you guys. But absolutely, I think that they are definitely out for their own self-interest, regardless of what our position are. And some of what I'll talk about here is hopefully going to help you guys understand why I think that anyways. So this is Understanding Russia as a Strategic Competitor to the United States. I am Captain Mark Verbruggen. I am the JW Department Director, so you guys are actually just starting the JW block now. And so a lot of this has become sort of a passion project for me. So I went to school, ROTC, and Russian language and culture was my undergraduate degree. I did Penn State for my master's degree, and it was geospatial intelligence, and it was all focused on Russia. And actually, some of the stuff that you guys will see in here was actually stuff I produced for my master's degree program. But basically, I have been a giant Russia nerd, especially since college. So this has become a passion project that eventually led to this elective being something that I teach here to you guys. I do teach a second one as well in the third block about their military specifically. So this is more focused on their policies, their politics internally, and then their some of the foundational documents. So we'll talk about some of that. So what we're going to talk about, what does the Russian Federation want, and to do that, we'll look at some of their strategic goals and directions from their documents themselves. Not like my opinion of it, but the actual documents themselves. Then we'll talk about what the Russian government's doing to achieve those goals that they lay out in those documents, and that has a lot to do with some of their activities inside and outside of Russia. And then we'll talk about why it's a challenge to the United States and what I think we should do about it. And then we'll talk about some current events at the end, as long as we have time. So very brief historical context before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of the documents and some of the policies. So to put it into context, you had the February Revolution that happened in March of 1917. Why March when it's called the February Revolution? They were using the old calendar. Before they switched to the I guess, Gregorian calendar, it happened in February. That was when the Tsar was overthrown and the provisional government was established. And then in November of the same year, you had the October Revolution, and that was when the provisional government was set up and that's sort of when when that provisional government collapsed and the civil war ensued, which ultimately was resolved in December of 1922 when the Bolsheviks won the civil war and established the Soviet Union, basically. So fast forward about 60-some years, you have the Berlin Wall fall, and that's when Soviet control over Eastern Europe begins to fade, and it was a house of cards after that. You had glasnost, perestroika, and so because of those policies, you had the hardline communists attempt a coup against Gorbachev. Gorbachev, because of Yeltsin's help, was able to fight off the coup, but by that point, the system had been so weakened that you saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's when the Russian Federation was set up, and the other states basically got their independence out of that as well. So December of 1991, you had the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Russian Socialist Federal Republic, take over as the president of the Russian Federation. So he was in charge, and it was a very tumultuous time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But then he became very unpopular by the end of his 8 years in power, and he basically appointed a nobody to run on behalf of his party, Vladimir Putin, which you guys are probably all well acquainted with by now. But he's sort of been in power one way or the other ever since as either the president or the prime minister. So this is a total population of the Russian Federation based on their census from 2010. So this is just to give you guys an idea of what the population looks like in Russia itself. You can kind of see the Far East, even though they're very large areas, they are sparsely populated. Most of the population within the Russian Federation is focused around Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the Caucasus. This next map is just population density, so it's kind of a more refined view of the last map. But basically you can see the population out in the Far East, besides Vladivostok, is very, very sparsely populated, with all of the population basically being focused around a lot of the dense urban centers. This is population change from 1989, so just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, until the last census in 2010. And you can see that the dark red is where the population has changed negatively the most, and dark blue is positive changes. So as you can see, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, most people have fled the Far East, and they've moved into the Urals, and they've moved into the Caucasus, and again, Moscow and St. Petersburg. So what will be interesting to see, because the next census is due to be, they actually just finished conducting it this past September, and so it's due to be released. For half of the data is going to be released early next year, and then by the end of next year is when they're going to release the full census data. So what'll be interesting to see is what happens to the southern part. Let me actually see the southern part of Siberia here. You have a lot of Chinese migrant farmers coming across the border, and that's actually become a source of tension between Russia and China. So it'll be really interesting to see what the data says about these areas and the population change, and whether or not those migrant farmers are making a difference, and what the future could hold in terms of tensions between Russia and China based on the population moving into the migrant farmers moving across the border into Russia. So the government of the Russian Federation itself, it's set up a lot like ours in a way, but there are some key differences, obviously. So the president of the Russian Federation, elected by a popular vote, or elected by a vote just like our president, and then you have the government of the Russian Federation, which is actually appointed by the president, and those are the prime minister and his cabinet. So the chairman of the government is the official term in their constitution. That's their prime minister, basically. That's what most people colloquially refer to them as. And then you have the deputy chairman of the government, which is the deputy prime minister. And then you have the federal ministries that are all appointed by the president of the Russian Federation. They also have a bicameral house, just like we do. So they have theirs is called the Federal Assembly. And theirs is more of a parliament style than ours is, obviously. But they have an upper house, the Federal Council, and they have the Duma, which is the lower house. And we'll talk about those specifically a little bit later on, just next slide here. And then they also have a judiciary branch, just like we do. Their constitutional court is like our Supreme Court. They deal with anything related to the Constitution. They have a Supreme Court, but it is not like our Supreme Court. It is basically anything not related to constitutional issues that relates to people, the issues between the people and the government. And then they have the higher arbitration court, which is basically law, like financial suits. So they deal in everything financial, basically. So that's a very broad overview of what their government structure looks like. So into a little more specifics, the Duma itself. So the most recent elections actually just happened the beginning of October, and they just got seated a couple weeks ago. So it was actually a relatively, so the United Russia Party, which is Putin's party, but he's not officially associated with him, but he unofficially is. They won the election in a landslide, but they actually lost a lot of seats. Well, they lost seats. They didn't lose a lot, I should say. And so in terms of political orientation, I guess probably center-right is what you would equate them as. Again, that's the United Russia Party. That people call it Putin's party. He's not officially associated with them, but a lot of them align themselves with Putin, and he promotes them quite a bit. The Communist Party, they won the most seats in the recent election. Obviously, their name is self-descriptive. They're a left-wing party based on the communist principles. They actually, I can't remember the exact number of seat changes. I think it's like 15-ish seats they gained, unseating some of the United Russia Party members. The Liberal Democratic Party, they lost seats in this recent election. They were the second largest party in the Duma. They are, unlike what you would assume from their name, they are not a center-left party. They are like a further right-wing party than the United Russia Party. They're a lot of like diehard nationalists, honestly. And so they lost a few seats. They lost like 20 seats in this recent election, which is kind of interesting. The Just Russia Party, they stayed about the same in terms of the number of seats they had. They're sort of a centrist party. The New People's Party is a brand new party that was created and won quite a large number of seats this past election here. And they're sort of like a classically liberal, like center-right type party. And they won quite a bit of seats. And then you actually ended up with quite a number of independents this time around as well. So that is how the Duma is set up. So there are 450 seats total, and they are directly elected just like our lower house of Congress is as well. They serve 5-year terms. So that is very different from the Federal Council. So the Federal Council is their upper house in their Federal Assembly. They have 170 members, and they also serve 5-year terms. But they are, I guess, indirectly elected is, I guess, the best way to describe it. So you have one member who's nominated by the executive authority of the region for which they're serving. So usually the governor of the district they live in. And then one is approved by the regional legislature. So in that sense, they're indirectly elected by the regional legislature, but then one member is appointed. They are not allowed to align themselves by parties in the Federal Council. So they're allowed to be political members, but they're not allowed to organize or basically vote along party lines inside the Federal Council. So they're officially nonpartisan, is I guess the term that they use if you go to the website of the Federal Council, they'll tell you these are nonpartisan members. So that's partially true. Again, they're allowed to maintain their party membership, but they can't organize along party lines. So that's very different from our Senate, I guess, is the best way to put it. So in terms of the Russian economy, we'll talk about Putin's popularity, but a lot of what I'll talk about here in the economy is directly related to Putin's popularity. So this is just a graph of the GDP, their purchasing power parity in US dollars from the collapse of the Soviet Union, or well, I guess slightly, but well, yeah, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, all the way until I think it was early last year when I took the snapshot, or early this year when I took the snapshot. So this area that I have highlighted is the 90s. This is the Yeltsin years, and you can kind of see exactly why Yeltsin became so unpopular. The economy was struggling. It was not a good time for Russia. They were paying Soviet debts, and they ultimately ended up defaulting on those in 1998. Then they were transitioning from a planned economy of the Soviet Union to a market economy, and that was plagued by just corporate cronyism, nepotism, just cheating, the typical Russian mafia. I guess the movies you'll see about the Russian mafia. This was that era, and it was running rampant in Russia, and it was destroying society as a whole, and it was very unpopular. Or that's why Yeltsin was so unpopular in this era. And it was plagued by inflation. I wouldn't call it hyperinflation, but it was not a good time for the Soviet economy at all. At this point that I have right there that's when Putin takes power. The day before 2000 started is when Putin took power after the election, and as you can kind of see, it's been sort of on the up and up ever since. So a lot of why Putin is popular within Russia has to do with a lot of whether or not he actually caused the economy to go up in this direction. You could debate that, but a lot of the reason he is popular is because that has happened while he's been in power. At this point, 2006, they actually overtook the GDP of the former Soviet Union. And so, like I said, you can kind of see, besides a little dip here and here. It's been on the up and up ever since. It is, I would still qualify it as this is relative to China, the United States, and every other developing country, they are relatively stagnant, but they're at least moving in a positive direction. So I guess that's a pretty good qualifier to add here. So another reason that Putin has maintained popularity, the United Russia Party itself has maintained popularity, is because of reversing this trend and trying to stabilize the society, I guess. So as you can kind of see, birth rates were during the Soviet Union, the birth rates were higher than death rates, and the collapse of the Soviet Union created that, or caused that trend to absolutely reverse. And it was again through the 90s, and it wasn't until 2012 when that trend finally equalized, and you had birth rates equal to death rates, and now they're finally diverging in a positive direction. So again, a lot of that has been a focus and I guess a talking point that Putin and Medvedev have had ever since. And actually, in this past national security strategy, they talked about increasing the birth rate is becoming a prerequisite for increasing the birth rate has become a prerequisite for increasing the population of the Russian Federation, not only in terms of stabilizing the economy, but drawing in other people to the Russian Federation itself. So that is actually a talking point within their newly released national security strategy as well. And again, it is diverging in a positive direction. So they've successfully been able to reverse the trend, and they're working to improve that. And that, again, explains a little bit of the popularity of the United Russia Party. So this is Putin's popularity. Qualifier, this is from the Levada Center. That's the source for the data. It's kind of like Russia's version of the Pew Data Research Center. They are independent, so I know I get that question quite often from people. They've actually gotten into conflict with the Kremlin over reporting negative trends. I couldn't say for 100% certainty that like these numbers are 100% accurate, but for absolutely the trends that they highlight are accurate completely. It's weird for most of us to think, but ever since Putin's been in power, except for the very beginning, his popularity has been over 60%, at least according to what the Levada Center says. So that's interesting a lot, and I would say that's probably pretty accurate, especially towards the latter half of his presidency, or the most recent term after he got reelected and overtook the presidency from Medvedev. So So some of the trends I want to highlight on here, the biggest surge positively when he almost got to 90% approval, or actually over 90% approval, was immediately after the annexation of Crimea. So you saw, and that had to do a lot with the way the media reported it beforehand and afterwards. So they stoked nationalism within the Russian media domestically to build up the Crimea is important, we're going to take Crimea, or we're going to secure Crimea, we're going to save the Russians that live there. And then when they actually did it, although they denied that they actually did it for a few months before Putin came out and said that they actually did it, they ran a lot of stories basically saying, we've retaken Crimea, this is a huge win for the Russian people. And so the way they played it in the media that created a huge surge in Putin's popularity. They used the media to their advantage for that one. When his popularity took a hit was when they announced the rise in retirement age back in, I think it was 2018, early 2018. So it was only a few years when basically they increased for males, I think it was 5 years for eligibility for pension, and for women it was 2 years an increase in age before they were eligible for pensions. But that was insanely unpopular, and so his popularity took a hit. And so he hasn't really recovered from that, I guess, in terms of it hasn't gotten back up above 80% again. But after coronavirus began to impact the Russian Federation, that also affected his popularity in a negative way. And then the Navalny, the protests following Navalny's arrest upon returning from Germany also saw his popularity take a hit, although not nearly as big as some of the other things in the past as well. So I guess one thing that I wanted to highlight in this slide is, so don't get the wrong idea about Putin. He's not some Bond villain. He's not out to destroy the United States. He is definitely out for the interests of his country, and he's very good at utilizing the media to maintain his popularity within the Russian Federation. So he's not he's like I said, he's not a Bond villain, and he actually is relatively popular within the Russian Federation. Not necessarily. You could debate whether or not it's because of his actual policies, but I would say he's definitely skilled at using the media to maintain that popularity within the Russian Federation among the Russian people. So sort of related to that, the attitude of the Russians towards the United States. So it flip-flops quite a bit. It goes up and down, and so the biggest negative trend when the United States and Russians didn't, or when the Russians viewed the U.S. most negatively, you had the sanctions over the Crimean conflict, you had Russia's credit rating being cut to poor, and the FBI arresting 3 suspected SVR agents in the United States. All that happened right there, and that was the peak. And so the thing I wanted to highlight here, this also has a lot to do with the media in Russia and in the United States. So this graph here is actually from Pew, and this actually shows the polling side to side. So the green is the Russian view of the United States, and the blue is the United States view of the Russians. And so they follow along the same line. And I checked a couple of the data points, and a lot of it has to do with the stories that the respective media is running about the other nation at the time. It influences the views that we have of Russians and the views that Russians have of the United States. So if there's one thing that you get out of this entire presentation I'm about to give, is that the Russian Federation is a rational actor whose goals are to establish their dominance in what they consider their sphere of influence. They call it their region of privileged interests, and to increase their global influence and prestige, and to use that influence to establish a polycentric world order in which Russia is a major player. So while the specific goals of the Russian Federation don't necessarily conflict with the goals of the United States, the way that Russia intends to accomplish those goals presents a direct strategic challenge to the United States, specifically our allies in NATO. So I'll talk a lot about that here in a second. So this red line, I apologize, it's very crudely drawn. PowerPoint didn't give me a fancy tool to automate that, but that is, the red line would constitute what I would call Russia's sphere of influence, or what they call their region of privileged interests. So what you'll notice is that red line, it follows along natural boundaries, and that's for a reason. So you have deserts, you have mountain ranges, you have bodies of water. All of that is because Russia has a justifiably justifiable paranoia of being invaded. So throughout their history, they've been invaded by the Mongols, they've been invaded by the French, they've been invaded by the Germans, they've been invaded by the Swedes, by the Finns. They've been invaded via land many, many, many times. And so they've created, they're trying to maintain relations along their sphere of influence, and any encroachment on that sphere of influence they view as an existential threat because of the many times they've been invaded via land borders. And when we talk about the Northern Sea Route here, when we get to the Arctic, the thawing along the Northern Sea Route also presents a challenge, because it's also a new route that could present a risk of invasion from the north, because you have the Northern Sea Route opening up, and that's basically presenting a new boundary that they'll have to watch over. So what does the Russian Federation want? They want to erode the legitimacy of NATO, and they want to counter or negate the capabilities of the alliance, or just basically delegitimize them and try to tear that alliance apart. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get, especially talking about Turkey. So they also want to establish a multipolar or polycentric world order with significantly more Russian influence, while also maintaining the essential Russianness at home. So they don't want to lose the cultural, traditional values of what it means to be Russian, but they also want to be able to branch out. So I guess they want to benefit from globalization, but they don't want that globalization dividing their society, and that's, I guess, the way they phrased it in a lot of their documents. They want to regain the relevance and power similar to that of the Soviet Union, be it political, economic, or military, but they don't want the additional costs of creating the Soviet Union. So when people say that they're going to invade Ukraine and try to take over their land, I would say that's probably not going to happen, because they don't want to be responsible for that land or the people that live in it. They want the influence, and they want to keep them away from the West, but they don't want to be directly responsible for governing that land. So they don't want that additional cost of actually governing a Soviet Union-style empire, but they want to maintain that sphere of influence. So a lot of I guess the analysis that we'll talk about comes from their national security strategy, or national security concept, depending on how you translate it. The most recent one was signed and approved on 2 July of this past year, and it replaces the version from 2015. So some of the things that it definitely hits on, and I'll talk about a few times in the next few slides as well. They talk about the increasing number of centers of power. So this is when they talk about multipolar or polycentric. They say that is the current trend, and it's happening, and they're trying to accelerate it. They don't say they're trying to accelerate it, but you can kind of sense that from a lot of what they're doing. They're also envisioning a Russian Federation as a center of power in that in that polycentric world order. And they're talking about the modern security environment being one where Western states are in decline, facing enduring crises, and trying to maintain their hegemony, fighting against the multipolar or polycentric world order. And that inherently makes the world more unstable because they're saying the West is going to lash out as they're in their dying breaths trying to maintain their hegemony is basically the way they phrase it. So that, to contrast that, the Russian Federation, they say, is internally stable due to policies building up the economic, political, military, and spiritual potential of the Russian Federation. So they're saying their society is united and enhanced because of their essential Russianness, and so that makes them stable, and that's a reason they should be a center of power. That's basically the way they have that spelled out in their national security strategy. And one thing that I really want to hit on is they have an entire section on information security in their national security concept or national security strategy. So that gives you any idea of where they want to focus their efforts. It is the information sphere. National security priorities. The ones here on the list. Whoops, sorry. So I'm going to have a lot of words on the next few slides here. I will not read all of them. I'll just kind of hit on some of the key ones. But some of the things you'll definitely see is protecting the Russian people's, talk about, the potential of the Russian people, national defense, economic prosperity and security, scientific and military potential, they touch on that as well. And then strategic stability and mutually beneficial partnerships is a big one. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, especially when you talk about the ways they go about maintaining those relationships. So the national interests of the Russian Federation. So you can read, the slideshow itself is actually available to you guys in Canvas. So if you want, you can actually download it. And the reason I have all these words in the slide is so you guys can go back and actually read it. And I link it to the document as well. So you can actually go back and read all of these. But I'm gonna throw this box up on top of a lot of these just to show you the key ones. So maintaining civil peace and harmony in the country, protecting the Russian society from destructive information and psychological impact. So that information sphere is what they're talking about there. Environmental protection, they're actually genuinely interested in environmental protection, especially when you talk about the Arctic. So permafrost is melting. You might have seen a couple of news stories about the Norilsk oil spill, the diesel spills up there, just the crumbling infrastructure because the permafrost is melting underneath a lot of the infrastructure they have up there. So the trend in the Arctic with the warming temperatures is melting the permafrost, and it's actually destructive to their infrastructure up there. So they're actually genuinely concerned about protecting the environment, not necessarily altruistically, but because of the impact that it's having on their infrastructure. So again, the traditional Russian spiritual and moral values and preserving culture, again, they don't want to lose that. They harp on that almost everywhere you read any of their strategic documents, they'll talk about that. And then strategic stability is the big one. We'll talk about their efforts to maintain those partnerships, specifically with China, but also with some other countries that they have within what they call their region of privileged interests. Sorry. So areas of focus for national security. So military technical sphere, nuclear deterrence capabilities, protecting the citizens of the Russian Federation outside of its territory. So this is a big one. So that was their impetus for involvement in Georgia. That was also their impetus for getting involved in Ukraine, both in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So don't expect that to go away. They've included it in their national security strategy every iteration since 2000. So I'll give you a little bit of background on that one. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, overnight you had the Russian people become the largest diaspora community in the world upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, because a lot of Russians had left Russia proper to go live in the satellite states. So immediately after that, you had Russians living abroad in the former Soviet Union. So again, that was the impetus for that was the impetus for them getting involved in Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea, and it'll probably be the impetus for them if they get involved in the Baltics or anywhere else, Belarus specifically. That's one area to watch, specifically is Belarus and what happens there. They also talk about modernizing weapons and military and special equipment. I talk about that a lot more in the military elective that I give in Block 3, but they've spent a lot of time and effort in fighters, in bombers, and in specifically the Navy as well. But modernizing a lot of the equipment has been a focus area. And then military technical potential as well. I could talk about that. That could be another long conversation. But they're investing a lot of money in capabilities like small drones, like handheld jamming capabilities, and a lot of other high-tech asymmetric capabilities is where they're focusing a lot of their efforts at. So also the list continues, but I'm going to highlight some more things. The changing nature of modern warfare, they're talking specifically about the information sphere and the impact that has on the way wars are waged nowadays. Ensuring protection of the state from armed attack and to meet the needs of the state in preparation of wartime. I think they talk about it. Yeah, so the next bullet as well, military patriotic education and training for military service of citizens. So getting their entire nation on a war footing in preparation for anything that's going to happen. So again, maintaining the patriotic education, I think, is the way they phrase it. They don't want to lose the cultural traditional values, and they want to stoke that nationalism of what it means to be Russian, because they don't want to lose that should a time of war necessitate that need within their citizenry. So that was their national security strategy. This is what, in that national security strategy, they talk about strategic partnerships. So they also have an entire strategy on how to maintain these, but these are the key partnerships they talk about. So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, obviously China is a part of that, given the name, but that has become sort of it's an unofficial military alliance, I guess is the best way to phrase it. So you have Brazil, so that is, it's headquartered in Shanghai, but it involves Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and a couple other former Soviet states, but it's become, again, an unofficial military alliance. But then you also have the BRICS alliance, which Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's an economic cooperation organization, but those are two organizations they rely heavily on for their engagement. The Collective Security Treaty Organization, that is a formal military alliance, and that is their version of NATO, basically. So those countries you see on there are Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Those are all members of the CSTO. It's not nearly as capable or as developed as NATO, but they're talking about quality development and building that organization to compete with NATO, I guess is the best way to phrase it. They also talk about the Commonwealth of Independent States, that's CIS. They include South Ossetia and Abkhazia and the periphery in that statement. So again, that's their region of privileged interests. So that's they want to maintain those relationships, again, to protect against any form of invasion. The People's Republic of China, obviously the biggest one. They call it an all-embracing partnership, and they label China as a key factor in global and regional stability. So I will say they say that in their documents, but there is a lot of reasons to doubt that, how sincere they are in terms of a full-fledged partnership with China. There are many sources of tension between the two, and we'll talk about those a little bit later as well. But I would say that they have sort of a frenemy relationship with China. They don't trust them. China doesn't trust Russia. But as of right now, they both are interested in maintaining some sort of united front against the West or United States interest, because they see that as a threat to their rise. So they're in it partially together, but I wouldn't say it's as unanimous as they try to make it seem in their own press. This is just a story from when Xi Jinping went to Moscow to visit Putin. They called each other best friends. They exchanged gifts and all that stuff. Again, I wouldn't go so far to say that that's actually true, but they definitely they make an effort to put on that image. India is another big one. They are trying to support India. They see that as like a mentor-mentee type relationship. They're trying to build up the military capabilities of India. They're trying to sell them their their Sukhoi jets. They're providing a lot of military training and equipment to them, and so they kind of see that as a key partnership in that region of the world. Latin America and Africa, they're heavily engaged in a lot of efforts in especially Africa, but also Latin America. And then they also talk about wanting to maintain a close relationship with the United States and NATO, but there are key things standing in the way of that. And they talk about current constraints to building a NATO relationship being the encroachment of NATO military infrastructure on Russian borders. And part of that has to do with our efforts in the Baltics specifically. So this is the foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation. This is the document I was talking about. This is what their policy is in terms of maintaining these relationships. Again, I'm not going to read everything on here for you. I'm just going to highlight some of the key points. So they want to consolidate the Russian Federation's position as a center of influence. and strengthen Russian culture abroad. So again, part of that multipolar or polycentric world order, where they have significantly more influence and are able to spread that around the globe through that polycentric world order. Bolster standing of Russian mass media and communication tools in global information space. So when you look at things like RT and Sputnik, those are Russian state-sponsored media tools that are specifically aimed at a Western audience. So they're trying to build those type of they say getting the Russian perspective abroad, but that's literally their version of communication tools aimed at the West. And they want to promote mutually beneficial and equal partnerships with foreign countries and international organizations. Again, that's caveated. And they want those relationships that are going to help create their polycentric world order, getting away from the unipolar world order where the United States or the West has a hegemony over the globe and kind of can dictate what goes in the international order. And again, you see it here again, ensuring the protection and rights of Russian citizens and compatriots residing abroad. Again, they harp on that almost in every document, every strategic level document they talk about. So don't expect that to go away. And that's definitely something to watch. Like I mentioned, especially in Belarus with some of the developing situations, some of the developing situations in Belarus, and we'll talk about that in the current events, specifically why I think that. So national goals and strategic objectives of the Russian Federation through 2024. Why 2024? Because that is when Putin is supposed to leave office. Whether or not that actually happens, we'll see. And actually, the next couple slides, I'll actually ask you guys' opinion about that. But the big ones, they want to take Russia into the top 5 economies. They've almost succeeded at that, depending on which metric you look at. Right now, Russia sits at number 6 in terms of purchasing power parity, and I think number 11 in terms of raw GDP. So they're trying to get into the top 5. They've been largely successful. Again, I would say, though, I'd still classify them as a stagnant economy. Even though they are technically growing, compared to other developing economies, they're not growing nearly as fast as they are. So I'd still classify them sort of as a stagnant economy. They want to ensure economic growth and rates exceeding international rates. As I just mentioned, that's not actually true, or that's not actually happened. They haven't been successful there. Maintaining macroeconomic stability and keeping inflation under 4%. They have been largely successful at both of those, although just this past month, actually, inflation peaked over 4%. So they haven't quite kept it below 4% the entire time, but they have been relatively successful keeping it under 4% at this point. But this is, I guess, the first half of their strategic goals, and the next half is actually crucially important for what I was talking about with China. So this part is developing basically transportation corridors aimed at increasing trade with China. So they talk about building transportation corridors to carry goods, including the Northern Sea Route specifically, but also expanding and modernizing rail and roads that are east-west and north-south in the eastern half of the country. So again, this is specifically aimed at the former Soviet territories and China, because they are so right now their economy is basically entirely propped up on oil and natural gas. In an effort to diversify that, they're trying to expand trading capabilities. So the Northern Sea Route is a big effort trying to get goods to and from Europe, but mainly it has been China utilizing that and paying Russia to use it. Right now they're trying to bolster that capability just trading between Russia and China, and they're trying to expand to Europe, and they're largely unsuccessful in terms of Europe, but they're banking on a growing Chinese economy and Chinese demand to diversify their economy, get them away from oil and natural gas being the sole driver of their economy. All right, so I'll talk this second. I'll talk this really quick, and then I'll have you guys vote on the next poll. But so this has to do with the constitutional changes that happened last year. So you had the All Russia vote. It was supposed to take place in April, but it was delayed until July because of COVID. But basically, the proposed changes you see here, they were voted on in their entirety. So a lot of people actually conflated this with a referendum on Putin's popularity. And I think that's a mistake to kind of see it that way. So this vote itself did not state whether or not Putin could run for another term. There was a separate bill passed in the Duma that said if this referendum passed, it would reset term limits. So you can kind of see, here actually it would. Let's see, where is it at? I can't see it on here right now, but basically it limits the terms that a president can have to 2, and it's total, 2 terms total. It's not concurrent like the previous constitution had. So it would actually, if this passed without that law, Putin would not have been eligible to run again. But because the Duma passed that state law, it sort of, or passed that bill, it sort of became a referendum on Putin's popularity, and that's where a lot of the no votes came from. So honestly, if you look at the list of proposed changes, they're relatively popular changes that most people would have supported. Especially, it probably would have had a higher percentage of passing had that referendum, or had that bill not passed in the Duma. But what ended up happening was it passed 78.5% to 21.4%, and there were 2 districts that basically said no, that voted no. But so overwhelmingly, people supported the bill, and I would say, unsurprisingly, no one expected it to fail because of how popular these changes were. So honestly, I'm not gonna say that. I'll let you guys vote first. So inside of Slido, let me open the poll really quick. I want to see what your guys' where's it at? So inside of Slido, go ahead and vote on the next poll. So how do you guys think that this will affect Putin? Do you think he'll stay in power until 2036 as he now can? Do you think that these will bring about positive political and social changes and Putin will step down? Or C, do you think that it'll make it difficult for other parties to challenge the United Russia Party, but Putin will not stay in power and will instead pick a successor? Or D, I don't know, I'm just here so I don't get in trouble for not attending an elective. Again, that's sort of the other option. I've probably unsuccessfully been unsuccessful at being funny again. All right, so most of you guys think Putin will stay in power until 2036. 55% of you, it's fluctuating. About 50% of you guys think that Putin will stay in power until 2036. And then the other large number of you guys, about 40-ish%, think that it'll make it difficult for other parties to challenge the United Russia Party, but Putin will not stay in power, probably likely picking a successor. So yes, I think, honestly, my view on it is C, that because of the popularity of these, the United Russia Party will probably sweep the next vote because of the policy positions they've taken and the changes they've made and how positive they'll actually be for society. But I think Putin sees the writing on the wall. I don't think he'll run for the next term. I think he's going to try to pick a successor, probably Sergei Shoigu, who's the defense minister right now. But again, that's completely conjecture. I don't have anything to support that idea. That's just kind of my own thoughts on it. It's entirely likely he stays in power to 2036. I just think that's unlikely. I think that would be unpopular, and he doesn't want it. I don't think he wants that unpopularity. I think he'd rather just pick a successor. But that's my opinion on it anyways. All right, any questions up to this point before we move on to the next policy document? All right, cool. So the military doctrine of the Russian Federation, this is their version of the national military strategy. So the current one is actually rather old. We were expecting a new one to come out 2020, but it didn't. And so what they've actually just announced is actually quite shocking. So the one that is now currently in draft being worked on is a joint military doctrine between Russia and Belarus, the Union State. So the Union State Agreement, it happened back in 1994. So when Lukashenko took power, there was an agreement between Belarus and Russia to basically act as one country economically. And Putin, ever since Yeltsin and then Putin, ever since have been trying to increase that Union State to basically sort of absorb Belarus. And Lukashenko has been successful at kind of fighting that off. But because of the hugely controversial election that happened last year, Lukashenko has been struggling to hold on to power, and Putin has sort of been his only support. So it looks a lot like Russia is about to envelop Belarus, and Belarus is about to become an autonomous or some sort of district within Russia. So that's increasingly looking like what's going to happen. So this is an interesting development that actually just happened a couple months ago when they made that announcement. And as of 5 November is when they announced the plan had been approved by the defense minister of Belarus and Sergei Shoigu. So we haven't seen the document yet, but apparently it's been approved. A provisional version of it has been approved between the two governments. So basically, the current version of it basically outlines NATO as the largest threat militarily and externally, and extremism within Russia. And when I say that, think the Caucasus, as the largest internal threat. So again, I'm not going to read everything on the slide here, but the main external threat being NATO because of a buildup and deployment of forces. So when they say buildup, that's an expansion, so adding nations to the alliance itself, specifically the Baltics, but also adding more capabilities and moving those to the border. So deployment of forces to states contiguous to the Russian Federation, especially the Baltics. So I'll talk about that a little bit here with enhanced forward presence, but also other efforts as well. And then the use of information and communication technologies for military political purposes. So again, the use of information operations to impact the military sphere, they view as an external threat. Internal threats, again, they talk about extremism being the largest internal threat. So provoking inter-ethnic and social tensions. Definitely think the Caucasus. The Caucasus is insanely ethnically diverse, religiously diverse, basically diverse in almost every sense of the word. There's a lot of inter-ethnic strife and conflict that happens. They've fought 2 wars, the 2 Chechen wars in the Baltic or in the Caucasus, and then there's also been wars that have been fought between groups in the Caucasus. So that was part of their impetus for getting involved in Syria as well, because a lot of extremists left Russia from the Caucasus to go fight in Syria, and they were worried that those folks would come back. If they fled the caliphate and they came back to the Russian Federation, they would come back, they would radicalize more people within Russia, and they would stoke separatist movements or just religious fundamental groups to carry out terrorist attacks. So they are very worried about extremism in the Caucasus. They also talk about undermining historical, spiritual, and patriotic traditions. So again, the essential Russianness that they view it as, and also just generally terrorism and anti-constitutional movements within the Russian Federation is what they view as their key internal threats. And then main military threats, again, it's no surprise, it's NATO. The demonstration of military force in the course of exercises in territories of states contiguous to the Russian Federation or its allies is the largest military threat to the Russian Federation. So you can read more specifically about that in the document itself or on the slide later on as well. But I'm not gonna bury the lead. They view NATO as the largest threat. So one of the key things that I was talking about, why they view that as the largest threat, is the expansion of the alliance. So the addition of the Baltics in the 2000s is when a lot of those nations joined NATO. And then our efforts after the invasion of Crimea, we launched the Enhanced Forward Presence mission, which is basically, we moved about 5,000 troops, NATO troops, not just US troops, into the Baltics to basically ensure that we didn't have another Crimea happen in the Baltics. So I will say that Crimea and the Baltics are very different situations. So I could talk about that for days and debate that with some of you guys, I'm sure. But they were worried that Russian troops would roll over the border into the Baltics and try to retake the Baltics again. So this is our effort to basically deter that from happening. So their mission is basically to make clear that an attack on an ally will be considered an attack on the whole alliance. So basically by moving troops in there, it's a deterrent because that would, if there was any question whether or not that we would invoke the Article 5 protections for the Baltics, us stationing troops there now deters Russia in an additional way because we will definitely invoke Article 5 if a nation state is attacked and we have troops in that country. So that's basically our reason for creating the Enhanced Forward Presence mission. The U.S. contingent is actually in Poland, and then you can kind of see the flags from other nations. Our partner nations are all are in the various countries as well. Again, our mission is in Poland specifically. So I mentioned that their national security strategy has a whole section on information operations. So what they consider information operations is a lot different than well, I shouldn't say a lot different, but it's a lot wider of an aperture than what we consider information operations. So you'll see it referred to as hybrid warfare or the Gerasimov doctrine, named after Yuri Gerasimov or Valery Gerasimov. That's a picture of him up there. So it's deceptive to call it the Gerasimov doctrine because he actually didn't develop it. A lot of it is a carryover from the active measures of the Soviet Union. Again, it involves a lot more than what we would consider information operations. It involves PSYOPs, information ops, cyber warfare, media manipulation. So some of the key players on the Russian side are the Latak Internet Research or the Internet Research Agency. And then again, I mentioned the state-sponsored or state-funded media outlets like RT and Sputnik that are aimed at the West. But there's also a lot more that's involved in that as well, in addition to traditional things that we would consider information operations like cyber. So what they're aimed at, or what their goal is, it's aimed at eroding the social constructs and faith in the target society's institutions. So they take something that is true and divisive within a society, and they put a magnifying glass on it, I guess is the best way to describe it. So they're not creating completely false narratives and just setting them out there. They're taking something that's true or partially true, and they're trying to make it as divisive as possible. And that's why it is so successful. So some of the examples lead up to the Russian-Georgian War. So you had the president get elected. The Georgian president got elected in a revolution. He was pro-NATO, pro-US, pro-West, basically. And so they ran a lot. It looked a lot like you were going to have the Georgians roll into Abkhazia and crush like a separatist movement. And so the Russians sort of predicted that they were going to get involved in that. And so what they did is they ran a lot of media aimed at Russian people, not at Georgians, but at the Russian people within Russia to support it. They basically compared Saakashvili to Hitler, to Saddam Hussein, and they ran stories about Abkhazian villages and South Ossetian villages being pillaged and ransacked, and like stories of women being raped and children being dragged through the streets. And almost none of that was true, but it was partially true because you had clashes between separatists and the Georgian troops. So they took like partially true information and they ran it in the Russian media. They had Putin go down to the South Ossetia, and he interviewed this Ossetian woman who was pleading with the Russians to come protect them. So they successfully basically targeted their own people to support the movement. And then eventually what happened was Georgia launched an attack against Abkhazia, and there was massive support from the Russian people for intervention, and eventually Russia absolutely just crushed Georgia in that conflict. Another example, the 2014 information campaign before the annexation of Crimea, sort of the same thing. They ran a lot of stories talking about neo-Nazi Ukrainians come and kill the ethnically impure Russians. Again, the reason that worked is because there is a large, I guess, segment of Ukrainian society that is like sort of like neo-Nazi, and they despise Russians and they call them ethnically impure. So they took this small segment of the Ukrainian population and they made it seem like it was the huge segment of the population, and so that drove Russian support for intervention in Crimea and eventually eastern Ukraine as well. The 2014 through 2016, the lead up to the election, again, a lot of people mischaracterize that as Russia trying to help Trump get elected. Again, that's not at all what happened. It was the Russians trying to amplify division across U.S. society. So you see Russians running left and right-wing propaganda and trying to divide society along those lines. And then immediately after Trump gets elected, you see them organizing rallies that are anti-Trump and pro-Trump at the same location to try to instigate riots at the same location. So again, it's this trying to amplify things that are, or amplify opinions and ideas that already exist that are divisive within society, and trying to create clashes and conflicts between that in the target society to erode trust in those institutions. So this is actually a book from, a snippet from a book called The Invention of Russia by Arkady Ostrovsky. I definitely recommend it if you guys are interested in the use of media to manipulate people. It was the failure of the liberal elites to hear and address the concerns of the people rather than Russia's active measures that brought Trump to power and caused Britain to leave the European Union. Putin excels at spotting and exploiting weaknesses, but is rarely able to create new ones. So again, it's not these false narratives that just get created out of nowhere. It's taking existing things and amplifying them to divide societies. So also part of the information sphere is their version of how to protect against those kind of activities. So they call it the Sovereign Internet Bill. We've kind of called it RUNET. Essentially, it's a way for Russia to create an intranet so that if they get taken off of the World Wide Web, they can communicate internally. But that also gives them the ability to unplug from the internet in case they have stuff coming into Russia that they don't like. It was signed in May of 2019. It drove the creation of points of what we call the RUNET, where the points are restricted to where the Russian intranet connects to the internet. So again, the stated intent was to ensure uninterrupted access to national intranet in the case that Russia gets disconnected from the World Wide Web. But it also enables centralized control of access to where those points connect. So Roscommodore, they're the organization that controls when or where those points are and when they can get turned on or off. And then they also have the ability to shut down internet or intranet access to any region within the country or the country as a whole. And then we can imply from that they can also probably censor the information coming into or out of the Russian Federation, sort of like the Great Firewall that China has. Again, that last one is sort of implied. It's not confirmed, but we can kind of assume that just based on how we think it's set up. So they've actually already used this a couple times. Let me go back. So this was when they successfully tested it back in December of 2019, and then they actually just used it a couple. It was early this year, I think, when they basically threatened that that if the United States continues to basically impede on Russian internal affairs, that they'll exercise control of the sovereign internet bill, and they'll disconnect from the World Wide Web, and they'll cut out Twitter and all these other companies from being able to access the Russian market. So they were actually successful in getting Twitter to remove things that they deemed pornography or extremist content or anything like that. They were able to get them to remove about 3,000 posts, because they slowed down the content on all desktop devices and about half of mobile devices within Russia, and that got people angry enough to demand basically that Twitter remove those posts so they could get access to their Twitter again. It's kind of ridiculous and funny, but in concert with this, they passed a bill a few years ago that all information maintained on Russian citizens for social media websites have to be maintained on servers that are hosted inside the territory of the Russian Federation. So that's another thing they're using. They're leveraging that bill to force companies like Twitter and Google to build servers on Russian territory to maintain access to the Russian market. Any questions on that up to this point? All right, cool. So we'll talk about Russian activities basically globally. So we'll start with Africa specifically. So the map here is basically just it's a map from Bloomberg that shows some of the broad categories of what they're engaged in and where. But we'll talk about a few specific examples, and then we'll talk about why. So why are they in Africa? Actually, to be honest, it has a lot to do with global relevance. So if they're going to try to claim to be a center of influence in the world, and they're trying to be a center of influence in a multipolar world, they have to demonstrate relevance in one of the most relevant places on the earth. So Africa is it's probably the largest developing economy for a lot of the states within Africa, or a lot of the countries within Africa. So you have China that's heavily invested in the Belt and Road Initiative, the United States, Germany, the UK, all of these countries are involved heavily in activities ranging the full gamut of activities in Africa. And so if Russia wants to be relevant and they want to be a global power, they also have to be engaged there. But that also gives them access through their state-owned companies to a lot of key natural resources in a lot of these African countries as well. So what are they doing? They've been caught election meddling in many countries, but specifically Madagascar and Zimbabwe most recently. They have active military and private military contractors that are supporting the UN-backed government in the Central African Republic. They also have private military contractors in the form of Wagner Group that are fighting in Sudan and in Libya, engaged in their civil war. Again, I mentioned the state-owned companies. They're exploiting natural resources from many countries. So you got bauxite, diamonds, gold, and oil, and some other ones as well. But another big one is weapons deals. So when Libya collapsed under Gaddafi, Gaddafi was the largest importer of Russian arms. So they lost that market when Gaddafi fell. But Algeria is now the largest importer, and they import 8% of all of Russia's total arms exports go to Algeria. But you also have Angola, Nigeria, Sudan, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea. And then obviously the separatist groups in Sudan and Libya are also buying arms from Russian sources as well. But again, they're there to expand their influence. They need to demonstrate global relevance in that way. So the Arctic is the next one. So I guess it's technically abroad, but it's not. It's also domestically. This is a weird one. But Russia's deemed the Arctic critical, strategically critical. So for economic reasons and security reasons. So you have, I mentioned that Russia's economy is basically propped up by oil and natural gas. 20% of all of Russia's GDP mostly in the form of oil and natural gas, is produced in the Arctic. So if they lose access to that or their infrastructure is damaged, that directly damages over 20% of their entire economy. And then when I mentioned earlier about an invasion, they're paranoid about invasions. And with the Northern Sea Route opening up almost year-round, that is a route for a sea invasion should that happen. Obviously, probably less likely than a land invasion, but they're worried about it, so they're militarizing. Climate change has opened up the Northern Sea Route, and that's enhanced their opportunity to move goods back and forth, and also access to natural resources, which has been good, but it's also damaged infrastructure, and it creates a strategic challenge to them in the form of a new front for invasion. So I can't take credit for the two halves or the 60-40 theory. That CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies, they've developed a theory basically that looked at satellite imagery and a lot of the activity and purchases that Russia's making. And so they've basically, there's two halves. You have the eastern half, which is primarily for monitoring, seeing what ships are using the Northern Sea Route and what they're doing. And then the western half has largely been mainly focused on offensive and defensive capabilities. On the Kola Peninsula here, that is where a lot of their nuclear-capable ground and naval assets are located. So they definitely want to protect those. So that's, again, the western half of the country is being militarized mainly to protect those kind of assets, as well as that's where a lot of the population is, because you have St. Petersburg over here, Moscow over here, and then most of their population is centered over on the western half of the country. And then in line with that, the 60-40 part of that theory is that 60% of Russian activity is mainly for monitoring and building up infrastructure, communications infrastructure mostly, and then the other 40% is the active deterrence and offensive capabilities, including anti-access area denial in the form of S-400 and the new S-500 systems. So what are they doing? They're reopening Soviet-era bases and building new bases, and they're reviving and rebuilding the Northern Fleet. So they have plans to build additional aircraft carrier. They currently only have one aircraft carrier. One aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, but they were trying to build two more aircraft carriers from the Storm class. But that's been delayed until 2025. It'll probably be delayed further because their dry dock caught on fire, and they haven't been able to basically start. They're rebuilding the dry dock, but it was basically destroyed. But they have been successful in modernizing their strategic submarine fleet. They've launched, I think, 3 new classes of different strategic submarines, all capable of hypersonic or nuclear missiles. And then they're also nuclear-powered icebreakers. They've been successful building those, and they've built a lot of small armored vessels. So corvettes, mainly corvettes and cruisers, I think, are the two big ones. They've been successful building smaller, but they have not been successful at building the larger crafts. And then they've also increased the number of exercises and the pace of those exercises in the Arctic. They've invited, just recently they've invited China into exercises in the Arctic as well. But they've increased the scale, size, and the repetition of the exercises in the Arctic. So what's Russia's ambition in the Arctic? It's probably a mix of military and economic. So I mentioned before, a lot of their GDP is already produced up there. They want to protect that, and they're banking on natural gas demand overtaking oil. But then they're also worried about an invasion, but there also could be offensive capabilities being stationed up there as well. So this is, I mentioned the nuclear-powered icebreakers. They are the only country that has any at the moment, although they did give China the plans to build a nuclear-powered icebreaker. But what makes these unique is that they are obviously capable of functioning for a longer period of time. They're more powerful than traditional icebreakers, and they are dual purpose. So they are obviously, they serve a civilian purpose in the form of breaking ice, as their name implies, but they're also capable of firing Caliber cruise missiles as well. So they have a military capability on board these as well. So why is that important for us, I guess, as the United States? We only have 2 icebreakers, neither of which are nuclear powered, and actually one of them's hard broke. We have what the Navy calls hard hull ships. They can operate relatively permissibly in Arctic waters, but not nearly as capably as the Russian fleet. So again, Russia has the largest icebreaker fleet in the world, the only nuclear-powered icebreaker fleet in the world, and that is a very strategic advantage in the Arctic. This is from 2007 when they planted the flag at the North Pole. So we thought it was just a land grab. Looking back, it's probably a little more complex than that. Could have been strategic forethought, like, hey, we need to make this claim so that we can claim this land, so we can preemptively strike anybody who's come to invade us from the North Pole. It could have also been an economic grab, but it's a little more complex now that we look back on it in a little bit of hindsight. And so I mentioned that they're banking on the demand of natural gas overtaking oil. So they've invested a lot of money in building up infrastructure projects, digital and physical infrastructure in the Arctic. So Rosneft's Vostok oil project, it's a $110 million-ish dollar infrastructure program to build basically industrial towns and capabilities to move natural gas and oil along the Northern Sea Route. And it's supposed to move about 30 million tons of oil and natural gas along the Northern Sea Route between now and 2024. And then obviously expand that capability past 2024. It's going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. In the short term, it's actually going to create 400,000 jobs. In the long term, there's going to be about 130,000 jobs along that to maintain that infrastructure. And then they're also investing a lot more money in digital infrastructure for many things in the Arctic, but mainly for fiber optic cable and communications. So they've invested $850 million in their digital infrastructure project. That's supposed to run from this year to 2026. It's going to lay 12,500 kilometers of fiber optic cable from Murmansk all the way on the Kola Peninsula all the way to Vladivostok in the Far East. So they're hoping to achieve pretty high speeds with that. But again, that is to increase to basically make communications along the Northern Sea Route far more capable than it is right now. Anyone who's flown or been up in the Arctic knows that GPS is not very reliable in the Arctic. So they're actually augmenting their fleet. Actually, that's the next slide here, but they're trying to make communications and navigation along the Northern Sea Route far more robust than it already is. Far more robust because it's not capable at the moment, I guess, is the best way to state that. So they're launching new satellites as well to monitor and to bolster communications. So they launched the Arctica M back in February of this year, and it's the first in a series of 3, and it won't be operational until they launch the second satellite in 2023. So once the second satellite is launched in 2023, their system will be operational, and that'll give them around-the-clock monitoring, communication, and imagery of the Arctic to basically work in concert with their infrastructure projects that they're already working on in the Arctic. All right, so last question before we get to the current events and open up the floor for any questions you guys have. So what do you guys think poses the biggest risk to United States interest? Poll should be open now. Militarization of the Arctic, activities in Africa, Syria or Africa, Libya, Sudan, basically private military contractors that are working with domestic parties or in regional conflicts. Or C, the increasingly strong relationship with China in many facets. Or D, information operations conducted targeting Western democratic institutions. I'll give it another few seconds here. So about 50% of you guys think that it's D, information operations conducted targeting Western democratic institutions. And then the next largest group of you guys think increasingly strong relationship with China. So I would find it hard to disagree with either one of those. I definitely think information operations is probably the most volatile because they can be conducted without any sort of physical capabilities. But definitely, even though I've mentioned that the increasingly strong relationship with China, even though I doubt it's as robust as they claim it is, I definitely think it presents a strong strategic challenge to us. So absolutely. So why is all of that a challenge to the United States? So again, very obviously, we have benefited from a unipolar or a global hegemonic superpower status, whereas they're trying to impose a multipolar or polycentric world order. So it's obviously a direct challenge to the system we benefit from. And they view our allies in NATO as the enemy, and obviously a lot of our interest is in maintaining NATO and that capability. And they're also providing financial support, or providing support in many ways, financial, military, technology, to regimes that are fundamentally opposed to the United States or just operate unethically in general, and we don't think that's very good. But also they're conducting information operations aimed at destabilizing our society and other societies, whether or not they're aligned with us or not. So those all present a challenge to the United States. And then this is, I guess, where a lot of my opinion will come in, what I think we should do about it. So The biggest thing that I think we need to do is continue to bolster the alliance with our with partners in the alliance. As much as Russia hates the Enhanced Forward Presence mission, I think that's critical. I think if we didn't do that, they wouldn't have any reason not to invade the Baltics. So as much as that creates a source of tension and is a hindrance to us building any sort of productive relationship with Russia, I think that's crucial. And efforts like that need to continue. And I think we need to expand that into the Arctic. Work with countries in the Arctic Council or just other Arctic countries generally to sort of expand some sort of alliance like that, or some sort of effort like Enhanced Forward Presence in that way. Because if we lost access to the Arctic, that could present a huge problem, a huge challenge to us strategically. We need to enhance our presence to deter Russian overreach in the Arctic, Baltics, and Eastern Europe. So again, we don't want to overexpand, but we definitely, so again, things like Enhanced Forward Presence help deter any activity that's going to draw us into a larger conflict. I think we need to find areas where we can work with Russia, so forcing them to conform to international norms. So back up basically what they say they want to do with actual actions that are productive. So that would be a win-win for most of us. They would actually legitimize themselves by working with international norms. And then obviously we would get them to comply with those international norms, so that would reduce that source of tension with us. So I think that's one area where we could do that, or one way that we can do that. And some of those areas are conflict resolution, like nuclear treaties, stuff like that. Combating terrorism, extremism, drug trafficking, organized crime, the spread of infectious diseases, ensuring international information security, and solving environmental problems. All of those are areas where we say we have aligned interests, but those interests in practice diverge. So if we were able to work with them to kind of bring them along to our side a little bit and sort of force them to do what they say they want to do, that could reduce that source of tension. And then obviously we can also counter Russian information operations by kind of conducting our own information operations. And a lot of that is aimed at China, I'd say. So exploiting the existing divisions between Russia and China. Again, as much as they present this united front type of idea, there are a lot of historic challenges and a lot of contemporary challenges that prevent them from being as allied as they claim they are. So China doesn't just steal our technology, they steal Russian technology. There's actually a hilarious example of a Chinese jet that they think had crashing off of a Chinese aircraft carrier because they think that they stole bad Russian information. And the Russian media actually ran a story about it. It was really funny because they were basically making fun of the Chinese for stealing their information. So there's the border conflict that almost brought them into direct conflict in 1969. And then there's just other historical challenges between China and Russia as well. So there's a lot of things that we could exploit to basically turn their attention away from trying to divide our society and maybe make them focus on a more immediate threat in the form of China. All right, any questions up to this point? Otherwise, we'll move into current events. All right, I will cruise these really quick, and then I'll open it up for questions, but we're about on time right now. So we'll talk about some military cooperation, we'll talk about de-dollarization, we'll talk about Ukraine tensions, and we'll talk about Belarus. So recently you've had two big exercises. So CEBU, or Cooperation 2021, and that was a big exercise with China. That was actually conducted inside China, and Russia's military was obviously there. They provided about 10,000 ground troops, but they also provided some aviation assets as well. It's not new. They've been cooperating since about 2005, and it's been increasing ever since about 2014. So after the annexation of Crimea, they really stepped up their presence, or their cooperation in the form of exercises. And so actually just this past week, China and Russia just signed so the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Chinese counterpart just signed a new roadmap for military cooperation that's going to increase the number of exercises they participate in each country respectively. So you're going to see an even bigger deepening of the military relationship or military cooperation between the two countries. Although they do not have a formal alliance, they do not have a formal military alliance. So that's one thing I do want to harp on. They are not allied with China. So if we got into a war with China tomorrow, Russia is not obligated to defend China. Same thing if Russia got into a war with us, China does not have an obligation to defend them. And again, that goes back a lot to their mutual distrust of each other. So, but that's something to be watching out for, is the increasing number of exercises that they will probably participate in with each country respectively. Zapad is another big one. So this is their, they conduct a series of 4 exercises. It rotates every year to different military districts. 2021, it was the Western Military District, so Zapad, it's West in Russian. So that was, it was actually conducted in Western Russia and in Belarus. So you had Armenia, Belarus, India, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia all participate, and China was invited, but for some reason did not participate. But this was a huge military exercise. You had 200,000 military personnel from all of those countries. You had 80 aircraft and helicopters operating, 15 different ships, 300 tanks, and it's been described as the largest military exercise in Europe in the past 40 years. It was massive. But what you'll notice is the objectives for the exercise: to check and ensure the readiness of Russia and Belarusian military personnel to ensure military and security territorial integrity of the Union state, and to practice for commanders and headquarters in the management of forces during joint actions to repel aggression against the Union state. So it's sort of it's happening right in front of our eyes, honestly, is where you're seeing Belarus almost be integrated militarily now into the Russian Federation, not just economically as they were before the Union State Agreement. So it's really interesting to see this happen, and it's definitely something to watch as it rolls into the future here. So military cooperation agreements have also been a big focus area. So the big one that I want to harp on here is 24 August this year, they signed a deal with Saudi Arabia. This was one that snuck below my radar for a while because they didn't actually put it on their English language page. It was only on their Russian language page. So the reason we found out about it is because Prince Khalid bin Salman, the Saudi Deputy Defense Minister, tweeted about it. And so I went to go check the website, and I couldn't find it, and so I switched to the Russian page. I'm like, what is this? So why is it interesting, and why do we care about it? Saudi Arabia is one of our biggest allies in the Middle East, and they're now signing military cooperation deals with the Russian Federation, which is interesting. So it's intended to develop joint military cooperation, and there was a meeting between Sergei Shoigu and the Deputy Defense Minister, and that's actually up there, the top picture there is the meeting that they had during the International Military Technical Forum back in August of this year. But at the same Military Technical Forum, you had meetings. It was hosted in Moscow this year. That's why a lot of these meetings happened. But you also had the Russian defense officials, either Sergei Shoigu or Valery Gerasimov, meet with Jordanian, Egyptian, or Lebanese defense officials, and they all signed agreements that expressed deepening of military and military technical cooperation. So they're deepening their alliance network, although informally, but they're signing deals to cooperate in exercises, to trade arms, and to do other things with nations that we would consider our allies, which is definitely something to be at least watching, but also probably concerned about as well. De-dollarization is another thing to watch. What are they doing? They've actually outlined it in their national security strategy, but they're trying to enhance their economic security by eliminating the amount of U.S. dollars they have in their holdings. So their national wealth fund is where they used to have a lot of U.S. dollars, and they're getting rid of that. And I'll explain why they're doing that in just a second. But so they had about 35% of their national wealth fund, which is basically their form of their reserve. They had 35% of their reserve that was in the form of U.S. dollars, and they've now cut it down to 0. And that effort is, and they're making efforts to conduct all trades, especially in gas, oil and natural gas, in rubles or local currency for whatever nation they're trading with. And so because of that, they've had to create the MIR and the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, which is a direct competitor to the United States SWIFT program that the entire world uses. And so the Foreign Ministry said that they're doing that to ensure the safety of the National Wealth Fund in the context of macroeconomic and geopolitical trends of recent years, and the decision is aimed at de-dollarization of the Russian economy. So why are they doing this? There are 2 really big reasons. To avoid U.S. sanctions, because the only reason sanctions work is because they use the dollar, and their national wealth fund has the dollar in it. If we sanction them and we cut them out of the SWIFT program and we slap a dollar, some form of sanction in the form of dollars, they don't care now because they've de-dollarized and they're not cut out of a payment system if they have their own payment system that works. But also, honestly, it's a form of economic. I wouldn't say warfare. It's a form of economic competition with the United States. Oil and natural gas trade is dominated by the U.S. dollar, and that helps prop up our economy. Because those trades are conducted in dollars, that keeps our dollar relevant, and it keeps the value of the dollar high. If they are able to basically eliminate the trade of the petrodollar, basically, that would threaten our economic stability. So it's I guess an offensive and a defensive sort of measure that they're taking in form of de-dollarization. So this graph is actually showing the holdings that they've had in their national wealth fund of dollars over the past year. So they started doing it. They started cutting down, it looks like, in about 2013. But as you can see, in about 2018, it took a sharp dive. And now, as of 2021, they literally have like 0% US dollars in their national wealth fund. So they've been successful in cutting that out. And it's not just Russia that's doing it. China is trying to do it as well. Russia has gone to 0%. Russia's gone to 0%. China hasn't quite got there yet. But China is also making an effort to do this as well. Again, for the same reasons, to prevent sanctions from having any effect, and also to threaten our economic stability in the form of the petrodollar. All right, troop buildup in the Western Military District. So I will, disclaimer, I think this has been overblown, but I just want to throw that out there really quick. Ukrainian defense minister is warning of a Russian troop buildup on the western border, and they're saying, so Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, said there's 90,000 troops not far from the Ukrainian border, and it's very similar to the buildup that we saw in April of 2021. I would say it's probably not nearly as drastic as he said, because the actual buildup is happening near Belarus, and it happened about the same time that Zapad happened, and it also is about 200 kilometers or 300 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. It's almost in Belarus. So I think it's overblown a little bit, but you're kind of seeing a little bit of saber rattling. So Russia claims it's a Western or U.S. disinformation campaign, and Secretary Blinken actually just released a statement a couple days ago. The U.S. does not know Russia's intentions, but Russia has used this in the past. They've invented provocations along its border to justify military intervention. So you saw Georgia, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine. All of those have been similar examples of this, although I think this instance is a little bit overblown. So is an invasion imminent? Very likely not. It's further north, and it's actually way too far west to actually be an invasion of eastern Ukraine. The troops are, if they were to invade, they would have to invade almost above Kiev, especially from Belarus, basically. So it's not in a location where the troops are building up that would actually be advantageous for an invasion. So I don't think that's happening. I could be wrong, but it doesn't actually look that way. This is actually the map that shows where the buildup's happening. So that's the city where the buildup is happening. You can see it's basically in Belarus, and the invasion would happen way over here if they were to basically move their troops in. And this is where the separatists actually are fighting right now, and this is Crimea. So it wouldn't make sense for them to do that. It doesn't I guess geographically make sense. But so my opinion, honestly, I think it has to do a lot more with the dispute along the Belarusian and Polish-Lithuanian border. So I think the Russians are saber-rattling over the Polish and Lithuanian response to the migrant crisis they're having right now. So what could change, whether or not there's actually an invasion of eastern Ukraine or action in Ukraine? I honestly think an invasion of Taiwan could probably launch that. They might jump at a chance, thinking the United States won't intervene on two fronts. So they would probably, thinking that the United States, if they do intervene, they would only intervene in China or intervene in Taiwan. So they think they could safely basically destabilize Ukraine. And I don't think they would actually want to invade Ukraine, but they want to create a conflict, a crisis of conflict, I guess. A crisis of confidence, basically showing Ukraine that no one's going to support them, and I guess diminishing the view of the United States in the international eyes. If we don't help Ukraine if they were invaded, because we've put so much effort into basically saying they're our ally, they're our friend, if we don't help them, we now look like we're weak and we won't actually defend our friends. So that could change that, I think. But I don't think an actual invasion of Ukraine is imminent at the moment. So that is actually related to Belarus and part of this. So I mentioned before, this was actually driven a lot by the protests that followed the election in 2020. You had Lukashenko claim that he won the election. You had a lot of really legitimate concerns about the election not being secure enough or not being conducted in an above-board way. So he actually said that he's going to step down. So November 2020, he said he was going to step down once a new constitution is signed. January of this year, He said a new constitution is being drafted and it'll be here by year's end. It's still not here. I think it's a stalling tactic. I think he's just trying to wait out any sort of protest. But in May, he actually signed a decree changing the power of succession because he didn't like his prime minister anymore. And then in June of 2021, they actually withdrew themselves from the EU's Eastern Partnership Program. And so basically that's moving them away from the West even further than they already were. And then in September of this year, Russia and Belarus agreed to establish a unified oil and natural gas market and deepen economic integration under the Union State Agreement. So they were already basically operating for trade purposes as one country economically. Now they're going to create a unified market for their oil and natural gas, and now they're also building a joint military essentially. So this is going to be interesting to see how this actually plays out. But it's looking a lot like Lukashenko is trying to save his own skin. He doesn't think he can probably wait out the actual protests, so I think he's probably going to hand it over to Putin to try to save his own skin, is sort of the way it looks like. I mentioned Zapad already. It was conducted in Russia and in Belarus to protect the sovereignty of the Union state was the stated purpose. But right now you've also see, so there's a lot of Middle Eastern immigrants that are coming across the border into Poland and Lithuania. And so the Polish and Lithuanians are saying it's Lukashenko who's basically officially sanctioning them. He's flying them in and trying to move them across the border into Europe to destabilize the EU. And they're also claiming that Putin is supporting him in the effort. So Poland and Lithuania have both they've deployed troops to the border to basically prevent crossings. And you have RT at the border that they're filming it, claiming that they're beating the immigrants as they're coming across the border, and they're rounding them up and flying them back to Iraq or Iraq and Syria is where a lot of them are coming from. So you're seeing a lot of saber rattling from Poland and Lithuania, and honestly, I think the buildup is actually saber rattling to prevent any sort of escalation within Belarus. They don't want the Poles coming across the Belarusian border and getting into conflicts with the Belarusian military. So I think that's probably more actually what that buildup is actually related to. But yeah, so this will definitely be something to watch, though, especially with how this plays out. Will the Union State essentially just become Belarus becoming a province or a district of Russia? I think it's likely. That's what it looks like, but I could be wrong. But it'd be something to watch anyways. All right. So any questions you guys have or anything you guys got, feel free to throw them at me. But I will make one last plug before I start answering questions. If you could scan that QR code and provide any feedback after this, or you can download the slideshow and provide it as well via the link. But yeah, whatever questions you guys got, ready for them. Oh, cool. Thank you. All right, so I'll go in order here. So do you foresee us? Oh, whoa. Okay, starts at the bottom. What's the likelihood that Russians escalate things in Ukraine by continuing Western movements towards the Dnieper River and to turn the water to Crimea back on? Oof, that's yeah. Because so if you're following the news in Crimea, they've been devastated by floods, and now they basically have no water, no fresh water. So, I don't see that as a likely event, honestly. To move westward towards the Dnieper River and turn on the water. I think that it would more likely than not, you'd see them run media campaigns about inhumane treatment or crimes against humanity against Crimeans because they're not allowing water to be turned on from Ukraine before you actually see a Russian intervention because of the water being turned off in Crimea. What could be done to counter Russian information operations? Would we be able to divide their population through a firewall or to use another approach? To be honest, the way they have their the sovereign internet bill set up, it would be tough to kind of conduct those kind of operations. I think the best way to do it would be to focus their attention on China, because that would, I think, have more effect, because obviously China is literally on their border, so they'd be a more immediate threat. If we could turn the tide and make them appear as a larger threat, I think that would be more effective of a way to counter their information operations. Today, Belarus offered to host Russian nukes if Poland invaded. I did not actually hear that today. That is very interesting. To be honest, I don't think so they, in response to us saying we would move nukes to Poland. I think that's honestly more saber rattling, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did it. And to be honest, if they moved nukes into Belarus, at this point, it wouldn't honestly be as big of a game changer as it would have been like 15, 20 years ago. But with the advent of hypersonic weapons, where they're positioned isn't necessarily as important as what's positioned where. So that's my thoughts on that one, anyways. My name is Mark. I have red hair. Why can't we just be friends with Russia? I wish that as well, but I don't know who Mark in the red hair is. What's the likelihood that Russians escalate things in Ukraine by continuing what can be done to counter Russian information operations? What type of cyber warfare capabilities does Russia have that would put the U.S. on edge? So I honestly don't know that. I'm not a cyber officer, and even if I did know that, I probably couldn't brief that here anyways. Who do we prioritize, Russia or China? So who asked the who do we prioritize, Russia or China question? What do you mean? Oh, sorry. What do you mean? Whew, okay, so my opinion, if we got into war with either of them, we're screwed. Because, to be honest, I don't think we would end up in a scenario where we're at war with both of them. Because if we got into war with China, I think Russia would sit back and wait it out and try to see what happens and wait for us to destroy each other. And same thing, if we got into a war with Russia, China would do the same thing. They'd probably sit back and wait for us to destroy each other and leap at their chance to destroy whoever won that. But if we got into war with both of them, I honestly think we'd probably prioritize China over Russia, just because Europe has capabilities to defend itself. That's not the case in a lot of Asian countries. So we'd probably end up having to prioritize China and then maybe go back and try to patch up Europe afterwards. But yeah, I think we'd focus on China. Do you think Russia's winning in the information warfare domain? Absolutely. I know I'm probably not supposed to say that as a member of the Air Force, and I think we're the best, but honestly, I think we're losing in the information sphere. They've prioritized it. They have conducted a lot of efforts to build their capabilities in the information sphere. We haven't made nearly the developments we need to keep pace with them. Do you think our current action in the Black Sea will stop or slow Russian annexation and aggression towards countries in close geographic proximity? Honestly, I don't think. I think our actions in the Black Sea are more of a risk than they are of an actual deterrence. I think we run the risk of accidentally starting a conflict with Russia because I don't think they actually intend to annex any more territory. Crimea they got away with because it was predominantly Russians that lived there. If you look at the ethnic makeup of the Crimea, it's like 96% ethnic Russians. So they wouldn't be able to pull that same antic along. Even Eastern Ukraine isn't nearly as Russian as the rest of as Crimea was. So I don't think. I don't think that's even a risk, honestly. But again, that's my perspective. I could be completely wrong. Do you foresee a scenario where Russia and allies attack Israel in the near future? Actually, Israel is one of the nations that actually has pretty close relations with Russia. Even though they're one of our allies, they have pretty good relations with Russia. So I don't foresee that actually happening, given that Russia has actually been a pretty staunch defender of Israel. Even though they have funded and operated with terrorist groups that fundamentally oppose Israel, it's a very weird, geopolitical situation when you look at the Middle East. Do you believe that the 4 stages of ideological subversion that Yuri Bezmenov spoke of are being enacted inside the United States right now? Whoever asked that question is you're on the spot. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, if you haven't watched it, there's an interview with Yuri Bezmenov from 1982, I think. So he's a former KGB agent who defected to Canada, and he had this interview. I think it was PBS that interviewed him, but he basically detailed what the intent and activities of Russian Russian active measures were, and absolutely, if you watch that interview, you'll see a lot of parallels with what's happening in the United States society now, but also just I guess on a broader scale, some of the areas that have been affected by Russian information operations. I think that was the end of the questions that I had in here. I don't think I missed any. They were jumping around on me. So I don't think it'll happen under Putin. I think if we have, it could possibly happen under Sergei Shoigu, but I don't know enough about him. But I think if we had a more Western-oriented, or at least a slightly less unfriendly administration, I think you could see us pulling troops back from the East, Enhanced Forward Presence mission, maybe even offering NATO membership to Russia if they, under certain instances, like if they give back Crimea or something like that. It wouldn't happen under the current administration, and I don't think in Russia, and it would have to be substantial changes in. I don't know how to state this. I guess there would have to be significant changes in what we're offering Russia. We would have to offer things that we don't necessarily want to offer right now, and Russia would have to give up things they don't want to give up right now. There would have to be we would have to conduct a long-term effort to make them think China is a bigger threat, sort of the way that we did with China versus the Soviet Union back in the 70s. There would have to be some sort of long-term effort to basically make them see China as a larger threat than NATO or Eastern Europe, or Western Europe, I should say. I think it's possible if they do see China as a larger threat, because then they'd be willing to give up things, and maybe we'd be willing to settle on some things that we're not willing to settle on right now. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, honestly. It's sad as that happens. Because of things we actually did post-Soviet Union collapse, they're completely distrustful of anything we say, honestly. For good reason, honestly. We said we wouldn't expand NATO, and we did. And we've done things that we didn't help them during the 90s when they were in the middle of their economic collapse, even though we said we were going to help them. So I mean, they're genuinely, for good reason, distrustful of the United States or the West for anything we say we're going to do. So I don't know. That's my take on it anyways. Oh, absolutely. I mean, they make no secret of it. They view us moving troops or equipment into the Central Europe or Eastern Europe. They view that as the biggest military or external threat to their survival, for good reason, honestly. And I think that would be the biggest thing that would be the most appealing to them. But I don't think we're willing to offer that at the moment.
That being said, on that note, Latvia in the news today requested U.S. presence in a permanent military installation.
Yeah, I saw that.
In Latvia, do you think that's even plausible for ourselves, or a likely course of action for us to aid for them?
To be honest, that wouldn't escalate anything anymore. I mean, because there's already NATO troops in Latvia. There's a permanent NATO presence in Latvia. If we moved U.S. troops in there, maybe ratchet up a little bit. I don't think we'll do that. Sorry, what was that last half of that question?
Realistically, the question, like, are we going to, and would that actually create more tension?
It probably wouldn't create any more tension, but it also wouldn't give us any advantage. It wouldn't. I don't think we'll do it just because it doesn't change anything on the ground. There's already NATO troops there. If they were going to invade with NATO troops on the ground, they would have invaded with American troops on the ground. It's not going to change the calculus, I don't think. Cool. Anything else? What you got?
Peter, we're from the social media team. Can we grab a picture for everybody? If you guys will like scoot into the middle, we're gonna grab a picture. You got a campaign going of like, this isn't what your commanders think of SOS anymore. And when you talk to your boss, what they think of SOS is everybody just in Polivka and asleep listening to briefings for 8 hours a day. So we're trying to like show that that's not what it is anymore. So kind of a play on that. If we could do
So wake up, fool your commanders.
yeah. Prove the commanders wrong. We're having fun here. Okay. And then we're just gonna have you guys act real bored. Maybe a few of you like bobbing your head. Thanks. Okay. And sitting in the back.
Not a problem.
of